Talking about lifestyle, we were also concerned about education. You can obviously get good and bad education everywhere in the world, and if you can afford it, you can always get better education. But education in the UK is not the same as education in South Africa, especially in terms of the out-of-classroom activities. And we wanted our daughters to be South African in their character. There is really something about being a South African that maybe you don't recognize when you're in South Africa, but you do recognize it in other South Africans around the world. A sort of a go-getter, a resilience that I think probably emerges out of our context, but is definitely, I think, a gift that we could give to our daughters by having them educated here in South Africa. And the third reason, without wanting to sound sort of super saintly or anything, that's not how we feel, but we genuinely wanted to make a contribution. From a business perspective, I think it's a very clever decision. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, is the last frontier of economic development in the world. What's happened in Southeast Asia in the last 25 years is about to happen in Africa. And if you see pictures of Seoul, South Korea 30 years ago, you could be looking at Lagos or Mombasa today. And then we look at Seoul, South Korea today, and we realize where Africa's future is. So this, I really do believe, is where the action is going to be, and I'd like to be there. So that's the selfish side of it. But making a contribution, when you're living in London and you want to give back to the community, you've got to work hard to find people who are in need. You've got to work hard to find somebody who needs your help. Here in South Africa, the difference you can make in a person's life, which changes their family, which changes the course of history. You literally are 5 minutes away from those opportunities everywhere you go. And as a family, not just myself, my wife, all three of our daughters, that's the way we want to live. We feel that we are not just living our lives, but we're also making a difference. And I think at one level, there's no easier place than in South Africa to kind of get out of your house and make a difference.
Great, thank you. My next question for you is basically, what are the best and worst things about being home for you and your family?
Yeah.
You have listed some of the best things,
yes,
but
yeah.
What would you say are the best and worst things?
Okay. So some of the worst things about being back, some of the things I miss maybe, I miss high-speed internet. I miss it so badly. We had fibre optics in London, and I think internet speeds are increasing in South Africa, but it's still tough to that. Obviously the environment and the whole infrastructure environment can be slightly challenging, so we've bought a generator now, just accepting that Eskom are not going to be as good as they could be for the next few years. That's not a long-term thing at all. But you know what? The infrastructure is not falling apart in South Africa. The roads are good with a few exceptions, but then hey, there are those exceptions in London as well. And when you travel to New York, almost every road is a mess. So, people I think who complain a lot about South Africa's infrastructure haven't travelled much, because every developing country is developing. That's the nature of it. So there are some challenges around infrastructure, which it would be much better to fix. And I think it's just a recognition that you are living in a developing country, that you are living in a country that's not yet there. And at one level, without wanting to sound like I'm just not taking reality seriously and being too idealistic, I actually think that that's part of the charm of South Africa, is that you don't live in a place where everything's sorted and everything sort of just works. Another word for that might be boring. But you live in a place that is developing, that is growing. The danger, of course, will be if it doesn't develop. But certainly we see development. I've been hugely impressed and surprised by Telkom, for example, and how good their service has become. Hugely impressed with some of the internet service providers, even though they're struggling with a slow speed product. And South Africa does work. when you live in the big centres. We've got great shopping centres, we've got great airports, the Gautrain's fantastic, Sandton CBD is growing like any CBD is in the world. So there are lots of things to look at and say this is good stuff, and we can see the development. But you've got to be prepared to live in a developing country as well.
Great. And then Graeme, your message to homecomers, African and South African, what would you say to them? Why should they come home?
Yeah. I think very simply people need to come home to Africa, to South Africa, because Africa needs you. Now is the time when we can make a real difference. I think Africa does stand at the edge of something, on the frontier of something. I think we do have huge potential, and in the next 25 years we can do in Africa what Southeast Asia has done in their last 25 years. But to do that we're going to need human capital. We're going to need people who are passionate, who are committed, who have skills, who can contribute. So you can make a difference to history. The other reason to come back to South Africa is so that you can have a braai in the sunshine on any given day of the year. So do it for others, but do it for yourself. Just do it.
Thank you. Sorry, I have one more question for you.
Please do.
The pessimistic people, those people who sit on the sidelines and do nothing and just criticize, would you have a message for them? Or, those people overseas who just are the kind of the doom and gloom, they just foresee nothing good coming out of the country?
Yeah. So, a few weeks ago in Parliament, we had a bit of a bust up here in South Africa, and everybody, as South Africans tend to do, they tend to think the whole world is coming to an end when one thing goes wrong. I happened to go onto Google and search fights in Parliament, and discovered that South Africa didn't even make the top 20 of the last year's hit list. When people talk about corruption, they forget that one of the biggest scandals that hit the UK Parliament while I was living there was the corruption scandal, the expenses scandal in Parliament. When people talk about South Africa's government being broken, they forget to remember that the Republicans and Democrats in the United States are as broken as any democratic government's ever been. When people talk about load shedding and lack of electricity, they forget that California had rolling blackouts a decade ago, that Brazil had rolling blackouts for 5 or 6 years a decade ago. And that's part of what living on this planet is. There is no perfect place to stay. In South Africa, we know what our problems are. When people talk about Nkandla, for example, and corruption, I point out to them that at least we know about it. We know exactly what the amount is, we know exactly where it is, and we know exactly the situation. And so, for the pessimists out there, I think they're often very one-eyed. They don't see us in the context of the world and that these things happen everywhere. They also don't see us in the context of a developing nation. And there are great examples of developing nations like South Korea and Cambodia and Vietnam and Brazil that we can follow. And I think we are a beacon in South Africa of hope to other developing nations. We're top of the middle table of the developing nations in the world, with so much potential to do so much more. And I just encourage pessimists to get off the sidelines and get into the game and make a difference. South Africa is wonderful that way, as a democratic, open society where rights are protected and freedoms enshrined.